Hi, you are listening to the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. This podcast is for policymakers, governments, researchers, students, businesses, and anyone that is interested in conflict and development issues in Africa. On this podcast, we hear from experts from across Africa and the world. Your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa, will ask the questions you would want answers to. Michael Nwankpa has an extensive experience spanning over a decade studying, researching, writing, and consulting on conflict and development issues in Africa.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. I am your host, Michael Nwankpa. Today we are going to be exploring peacekeeping, peace operation, and peace stabilization mission in Africa. I am joined today by an important guest, Professor Cedric de Koning. Professor Koning is a research professor research professor in the research group on peace, conflict, and development at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, where he also co-coordinates the Institute's Center for UN and Global Governance. He's also senior advisor at the African Center for the Constructive Resolution of Disputes Accord, South Africa, where he has been since 1997. Cedric has 30 years of experience in research, policy advice, training, and education in the areas of conflict resolution, peacekeeping, peace building, and peace and conflict studies. Cedric, you have an impressive resume, and you've done quite a lot, a long-standing research and experience in this field. I'm so excited to have you on the podcast today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to join you, and I look forward to our discussion.
Yeah, great, brilliant. I was going to ask you, because we have different concepts. I wanted to start from that, but I think the best place to start before I ask you to say what the difference between peacekeeping and peace building and what implications these concepts have is to say, in the last since the millennium, since 2000, we have seen an increasing number of civil wars, proliferation of insurgencies, and terrorist organizations in the continent in Africa. So it seems that Africa seems to be the epicenter of conflict. Why do you think? Can you comment on this general state, and what are those factors that have given rise to this situation in Africa? Why do we have a prevalence of violent conflicts and civil wars in Africa? I think that's the best place to begin this conversation.
Well, Michael, I think there's very many reasons for that. Historically, you can just go back to slavery, colonialism, and the inequality in terms of the global system, and what that has the situation that has, or the condition that has created for Africa in terms of kind of built-in inequality with the rest of the world, especially the developed world, and a continuation of exploitation and unequal power relationships, since those days, since in the post-colonial period up to today. You can call it new colonialism or new imperialism, whatever you would like to call it, but there is a continuous inequality in the relationship between Africa and the rest of the world. There is Africa remains on the periphery of decision making and of the international economic and financial system, and that, of course, perpetuates a number of conditions that make Africa more I would say more exposed to various stresses and pressures which can contribute to conflict, including, on the one hand, external factors ranging from the effects of climate change to natural resource exploitation and other such factors, but also to a continuation or factors related to weak governance in Africa, corruption of leadership. And if we go more into the governance dimension, I would say we can see a very weak and shallow form of democracy that we've had on the continent. And a lot of the frustration we see with the recent coups, for instance, in West Africa and so on, I think is essentially frustration of people with the kind of empty delivery, the lack of delivery of the type of democratic systems we've had, where regardless of which government comes into power, from an ordinary person's perspective, the same elites remain in power, and they seem to be able to enrich themselves and exploit themselves, and the ordinary lives of people are not changing. And of course, that frustration then leads to inability to manage things like organized crime or collusion, also very often between political elites and organized crime. So there's so very many factors that contribute to the global South in general and Africa in particular, then being very vulnerable to managing conflicts, or to, in some cases, conflict coming about as a result of many of these factors and how people choose to respond to them.
Amazing. Very, very interesting. Very interesting. I like the fact how you combined the external influences with also the local influences, and they seem to be very, very with like two sides of the same coin. But one of the things I've seen here is this problem seems to be fundamental problems. They seem to be like structural problems. So if we look at it that way, from that angle, how does peace operations or peacekeeping, how does it respond to that structural needs? Does it respond to, how does it deal with these fundamental structural needs? What is the scope of peacekeeping? Is it just about dealing with the symptoms, or does it really deal with these structural needs?
So if you talk about the structural dimensions, that really brings me then to follow on what I said earlier. And if we look at specific contexts like Mozambique, where we have the insurgency in the north of Mozambique and Cabo Delgado, or if we look in the case of, for instance, in the Sahel and places like the Mali or Nigeria, if we look at the North Lake Chad Basin, problem with Boko Haram. I'm mentioning all of these because these are also places where peace operations are deployed. And so I'll come back to the peace operations dimension in a moment. But first, structurally, what we can see in all of these contexts is a tension and an inequality between the center and the periphery. So the center is typically where you have the main political and economic activity of the country, dominated by a certain set of elites. And then you typically have on the periphery, and especially in all of these cases that I've mentioned, a kind of north-south tension. Interestingly, in all three of these cases, the South is more Christian. In the case of West Africa, more coastal and therefore, exposed to the West and Western trade and Western missionaries. And the North is more Islamic and linked to the ocean of the Sahel, if you like. Right? And interestingly, in Mozambique, we have that same religious distinction where in the north, the people from Cabo Delgado, or some of the people in Cabo Delgado that are linked more to the to Islamic community, are in a sense more linked up with the Indian Ocean community, the Indian Ocean Swahili speaking community, and even economically and culturally than they are with, let's say, Maputo and the Christian Portuguese South. So that center periphery where the people in the north have been for generations, for decades, for centuries, have been excluded from the main power, economic, political power in the center, has built up enormous grievances over time. And of course, there have been various attempts to manage and to respond to that. But the current way in which that frustration is manifesting is through Islamic insurgencies or Islamic fundamentalist extremist groups that mobilize people based on that frustration. And some people turn to those groups because they seem to offer a challenge and an alternative way of responding to this inequality in the relationship with the center, because various previous attempts have been very unsuccessful in changing their condition, and so they hope that this new approach could change their condition. So that first of all tells us that the conflict goes much deeper than, it's not about just dealing with terrorism or with violent extremism, but in order to manage those and address those conflicts and transform those conflicts, we need to address that underlying drivers of conflict, which is the marginalization, the lack of economic opportunity, the lack of or the distance between the rest of the country and the periphery. So connecting those areas up with the center, and providing the kind of economic and political opportunities that the people in those areas are seeking. So in that context, what then is the role of a peace operation like the SADC mission in Cabo Delgado, or the UN mission, or many of the others, including the G5 Sahel force in Mali, or the multinational joint task force in Cabo Delgado? In the Lake Chad Basin in the north of
Chad,
Nigeria, the Chad and the Lake Chad Basin Commission area. All of them, I would say, their core contribution is to create stability and security, not as a way of a final solution to the problem, but as a first step towards trying to resolve the situation by creating more security and stability, which should provide the space that can then be used for conflict resolution, for peace building, for addressing these drivers of the conflict, right? For finding political settlements and solutions, for improving governance and basic services. So basically, they deal with the symptoms. They relieve those symptoms temporarily in order to create the space, a more safe space for the governments of the day and other partners and other actors, local, national, international, active in that space, to try and improve the situation and address the drivers of the conflict.
Interesting. So I think that there are two things that I see from here. You quite touch into the nexus between conflict and development, and the argument in that debate about does development follows security? Do we need to first secure and then development, or should we develop and development then creating a secured place? So that I think that debate is still not one that has been that has been answered. That question hasn't been really answered. But then again, if we look at when you say stability and then you say creating first step for other people, so are you saying, my understanding, my thinking from that statement is that it's like a military approach? So the military needs to maybe get involved in a place like maybe in the Lake Chad, where you have Boko Haram and other insurgencies, and create that situation. So is the military a part of that peace operation, or is it different from that peace operation? If we're talking about peace, should the military, what is that? Does that not create some kind of like paradox or some kind of complexity, whereas we're having a military, elements in a peacekeeping framework? How has that dynamic? How do you balance that dynamic?
Yeah, these are all very important questions and considerations. I mean, first of all, I would say that you cannot, in a predetermined way, say that security should come first and development come after. That kind of sequencing is, is maybe very superficial, because they go very much hand in hand. I mean, the way I described it in your previous question is that the essential role of these peace operations are to create stability for others to do development and governance. But that doesn't mean that the one has to come before the other in a kind of a black and white, chronological order. There is, of course, governance and development underway even during the conflict, and there's some form of security underway during the conflict. So they are much more interwoven and interconnected than that explanation maybe leads one to think. So certainly we are talking about a whole of society integrated approach, because the core problem is, as I mentioned in the beginning, this inequality, poverty, exclusion, the economic and political dimensions of it, and the insecurity dimension of it is just a expression of frustration, a symptom of that underlying tension. Right? So responding to violence with violence is usually not a good idea, right? Because you're adding fuel to the fire. And we know that very often, unfortunately, military responses is a very blunt instrument. So typically, if a armed force of a country or an international force even responds to in a kind of insurgency in a given area, they very often act harshly and in hard-handed ways to the whole population, because it's very difficult for those forces to make the distinction between, who are the actual individuals who are part of a more extremist group versus those who are living in the community. And of course, there's also a degree of interaction and an expectation or a suspicion that that community in large is sympathetic to that group and providing support to them and so on. So you can often find extreme violence also perpetrated by the armed forces that are reacting to the insurgency. I mean, I think it's documented in places like Mali that more civilians are harmed and dies from armed forces action in certain areas than from the action by the violent extremists. Right. So yes, a military response is typically a very difficult and sensitive response, and could easily cause harm and could easily make the situation also worse. Another way to think of it is that very often these military responses are not sufficient to, let's say, neutralize or significantly disrupt the armed groups. And then, in effect, if you are putting the armed group under pressure by, through instance, some form of peace operation, which forces them to change their tactics, to learn from your behavior as the peace operation, to try and find alternative ways of responding to the way you are trying to disrupt their behavior. What you are then doing, in a sense, is stimulating them to become better. You're not destroying them, but you are making it more difficult for them in a way that they need to then respond and improve their tactics and so on. So a reaction by armed forces that are not sufficient to significantly disrupt those insurgents can easily actually stimulate them to become stronger. And we often see this over time, that actually the armed groups become stronger and become more complex and refined in their behavior as a result of armed actors trying to suppress them rather than the opposite. So I guess the most important lesson here for us is that peace operations are on or armed, even if it's national action by armed forces, can never be an end in and of themselves. They can only be part of a larger political process. So if the emphasis is on resolving the tension and dealing with those inequalities and aiming to provide and develop a political project that can result in resolving those conflicts, in that context, a peace operations can help to create some form of stability, which can help that larger process that also have developmental dimensions and governance dimensions and so on. But unfortunately, often we see that the peace operations are deployed as a fig leaf for a response, right? So the government in question or international actors deploy such an operation as a way of saying, oh, look, we're doing something. But it's not really a serious political project to resolve the conflict, because often those elites in the center do not necessarily really want to address that inequality and that marginalization with the periphery. They would prefer to frame that as not really an internal problem, but a problem caused by some form of, international terrorism. And they would prefer international partners to help them to defeat those terrorists rather than deal with the real drivers of the conflict. And this leads to something which in my research I call the stabilization dilemma. And what this dilemma reflects is that the more successful you are as a peace operation to create stability, the less incentive there is for the political elites to find the kind of political settlements needed to end the conflict, right? So if you are the SADC mission in Mozambique, or if you are the UN mission in Mali, your end state is to create enough stability for the government to then enter into a process, let's say develop a political project to resolve the conflict, address the inequality, etc., improve governance, right? But the more successful you are as the UN mission in Mali or the SADC mission in Mozambique in creating stability, the more the political elites at the center feel, oh, the problem is dealt with. There's no more insecurity. Why would we then invest and spend the political capital to resolve that conflict with those people in the periphery that we in any way disagree with or do not want to accommodate? That's why we have the problem in the first place, right? So there's this tension between providing stability and improving security as a way of resolving the conflict, but then at the same time disincentivizing the political elites that need to make those compromises for finding a solution to the problem.
That is a very brilliant response. I think of in my own research as well, I've identified that dilemma, maybe not as sophisticated as you've said it. I've looked at it in the context of maybe election and democracy. And good thing you mentioned in your first response, how in Africa we have weak and diluted form of democracy that has not yielded much dividend to the people. So my criticism of liberal democracy has always been, focus on stabilization. So let's say, for instance, let's say there's a UN observer, let's say it's an election, and let's say there's widespread election malpractices. It could be, okay, we know this happened, but we'll just have to go with this to make sure there's stability rather than altering the status quo. So but if we look at that and say how peace operation, like you rightly said, can inadvertently, from what I'm gathering, disincentivize or create a situation whereby the political elites in these places are not looking for solution. So what is the scope of peace operation then? And what is the lesson in the last, let's say, 20, 30 years? Can we compare some peace operations that have produced a different outcome from other peace operations, and then can we then start seeing, oh, what can we do better, or what can we not do in this kind of like situations?
Yes, I mean, if we just look at United Nations peacekeeping, it has been an extremely successful project in the sense that most UN peacekeeping operations have helped to successfully, support a process of ending a conflict and starting a new phase in that society. So we can think of Mozambique or Angola or Liberia or Sierra Leone or Burundi, just to mention some African cases. Sorry, apologies. Where there were, civil wars in the 80s and 90s that led to a formal ceasefire and peace agreement in some places, which United Nations peacekeeping operations then supported during that transition period, and resulted in several decades of stability and introduction of multi-party democracy in most of these contexts. Namibia, another example. I would say what's essentially different from those examples, or that historic cases, and some of the operations we have now, for instance, the UN operations in Mali and the DRC and Central African Republic, where there's a lot of frustration with those operations at the moment, is that those operations, all three those operations, lack that kind of political project, that kind of peace agreement or ceasefire that has been so critically in the success of these other operations in the past. And the lesson for us is that the primary focus should not be on stability or even on protection of civilians, but on investing in finding a political solution. So the main emphasis should not be the peace operation, but on the diplomatic effort needed to create a political project, right? And this is the work of diplomats, of neighboring countries, of international organizations, of the African Union, of ECOWAS, of the United Nations, of all the different actors nationally and internationally and regionally, that need to engage, put pressure on the various key actors involved to find and create that kind of political process that can resolve a conflict, and then to sustain that. And if there's such a process, one tool to help sustain that is peace operations. Peace operations can help to provide a guarantee, a security guarantee, and other technical support for that process. But without that process, the operations themselves cannot bring about transformation. But they can be very effective, and we see that historically, in supporting such a process, because we know those processes are fragile, people don't trust each other, and so on. And then in those cases, the deployment of a peace operation can really help to bolster the evidence, bolster the confidence of the parties. It makes it more difficult for the parties to not implement the agreement that they have come to, because there's a monitoring process. They know there's a cost. The Security Council is watching, or the Peace and Security Council is watching. They're getting reports back from the mission. So it creates a process of support, but also of accountability, to have these peace operations in place in those contexts. So the most important is the political project, to focus on the diplomacy, to do the peacemaking, to create the political project, to sustain that. Then you can use a peace operation to support and build a confidence for that process. And then you can link that into the larger developmental and governance work that also needs to be part of that comprehensive approach.
That's quite interesting framework. That's quite interesting. So I was going to ask if that describes your concept of adaptive peace. But before, okay, maybe you could answer that. Is that what you mean by when you say adaptive peace, or how does that also how do you distinguish that from? Yeah.
Yes, yes, and the short answer is yes. But adaptive peace has several other elements. So adaptive peace is a specific concept or framework that I've developed based on applying complexity theory to peace and conflict studies, or to conflict systems, to societies that are in conflict. And the question was, we always say that these situations are very complex. What do we actually mean when we say that they are complex? Complex to resolve, right? And in my study for that, I discovered that there's actually a science that looks at how complex systems respond and evolve under pressure, right? This is a very interesting theoretical field, because it is applied across so many domains, whether you are talking in the context of physics, or in biology, ecosystems, or in different forms of human sciences, whether it's medical or psychological. But I apply it in the area of sociology and peace and political science, right? So I look especially at political systems, at societies, and how societies manage transitions from conflict to peace. And then especially as actors that want to support that process, whether we are local peace builders or whether we are international actors, whether we are a peace operation, what is appropriate, what's possible to do to support those kind of processes. And I would say without going into too much detail, the core things that would stand out from this approach is firstly, a recognition that these situations are, and these societies are indeed inherently complex, which means that the behavior is non-linear, highly dynamic, uncertain, unpredictable. And that means that we cannot approach that situation with a predetermined solution. We cannot come to that situation and say, oh, this is what has worked in South Africa, and therefore you must do A, B, C in the following order in Nigeria or in Mozambique, right? It means that in each of these situations are unique, and so context specific, and we need to find solutions that work for that particular context. And that means that it has to be solutions for conflict. Peace essentially has to emerge from the participation of the parties involved, the stakeholders involved. That's of course the local people, the national people, but also their regional partners, their international partners. It is a process of engagement, of struggle, of finding solutions. And that process cannot be predetermined. It has to be emergent or adaptive. So that's where the adaptive piece comes in. In other words, we have to learn from doing. We have to try things. Then we have to understand what is the effect of those things we've tried. And then we have to adapt as we go on and say, okay, this hasn't worked. Let's do more of this. Or this looks promising. Let's try more of that. So it's a continuous process of adaptation. And in the complexity context, we talk about feedback, right? So based on our action, we get positive or negative feedback, and then we have to adapt to that. And this is a process of a self-organized process. And in other words, it's not something that a few leaders or the UN or somebody can impose and lead. It has to be a process where everybody is involved, and we all learn from each other, and we all participate in the process. That's the way that social institutions are developed over time, that can then over time develop the resilience and the capacity to manage their own peace. It's not something you can do overnight. It's not something you can do by just adapting somebody else's model. It's something you have to develop yourself over time. So in short, that's some of the key elements of adaptive peace.
Okay, that sounds quite interesting. But you've mentioned there like a multi-actor or multi-stakeholder approach, one that no overarching institution would have to lead. But then when you were answering the other question, you did particularly identify the UN peacekeeping operations as extremely successful. But we've seen some of these missions in Africa where either is a partnership peacekeeping between the AU and the UN, or whether it's like in the multinational joint task force, whether it's just by the regional countries forming armies together, or whether whether it's SODOC, whether it's South Africa leading in places like Mozambique. What do you think it's in terms of this partnership? Do you think this should be the way forward, or do you think that Africa, for instance, should be leading because I know they have this 2063 vision where the aspiration is to be able to deal with its own security or its own prosperity. So, but what do you see moving forward in terms of these partnerships or this
I would say that
African
we are
focus?
I would say that
Go on,
we
go
are
on.
already at a point where Africa is leading our own peace process. There's not one process I can think of where the African Union or regional economic communities or key countries in the region are not playing a decisive role in resolving those conflicts. That doesn't exclude partnerships or relations with others. So partnerships are very important. And you've mentioned, a number of operations, and each of them slightly different, each of them unique, a unique partnership, a unique coming together of various stakeholders that have a stake in those conflicts. And when I say in the adaptive peace context that, there's not one particular institution that leads all of this, this is what we can say the SADC mission in Mozambique or the UN mission in Mali. That does not suggest in any way that those operations are somehow the leading entity in resolving conflict in those countries. As I explained before, they are playing a small contributing role to a much larger process where at a particular moment in time, they are providing some stability or security. But of course, the most important actors in all of these situations are the people, the key political actors in those countries themselves, the government of the day, the various other factors and elites that are involved in resolving those conflicts, and then other international actors that are playing a role in trying to bring about change. But none of those actors have enough power or agency to control that situation on their own. Right? It's an interaction and a complex system where each actor tries to influence the situation, but has to do so in cooperation with many others, and then there are others pushing back, and it's a constant process of adaptation and change and competition and cooperation. But it's not as if any one of those actors, whether it's the United Nations or the African Union or the government of Mozambique, at the end of the day, the government of Mozambique, should have the sovereignty to make the final decision. But of course, they are an actor in a globalized world where their agency is also limited, even although they may have the sovereign power to make those decisions. They can only do that if they have the support of the people, and if various international actors and regional actors and so on, are supportive of their process and the process that they've embarked upon. So, so that is the kind of complex interplay that I'm trying to share with you, and that I'm trying to capture in this complex adaptive system approach of adaptive peace.
Okay, brilliant. But before I come to the last question, I wanted to ask you, because sometimes we use concepts without people use concepts in a synonymous way without drawing distinctions, if there are distinctions. Are there any distinctions between, like, for instance, peacekeeping, peace building, and its other variants? What are there, and what implications do they have if there are distinctions?
So these concepts of course, are very useful for people working in that field to communicate with each other, to explain, different dimensions or aspects of a larger problem. So the classical understanding of these concepts are that, when we're dealing with the situations, let's say the situation, the conflict that we see currently in Sudan, to use an African example, we would say that what we first should try to do as local, national, regional, international actors is to try and prevent that conflict in the first place, right? So we talk about preventive diplomacy or conflict prevention. These could be actions that we take to when we see very either early signs of things that can contribute to a conflict eventually, like inequality, exclusion, or human rights abuses or hate speech. These could all be signs leading to a conflict, and then to respond to that through prevention. If the situation continues to worsen, we then talk about peacemaking. So peacemaking are efforts typically by diplomats or peacemakers or mediators from the local to the international level that try to bring the parties to a conflict together to either have a ceasefire or a peace agreement, etc. And then once you have an agreement or a ceasefire in place, that's where you can use a peacekeeping operation. So a peacekeeping operation is typically an operation that, like a United Nations peacekeeping operation, that helps to implement a ceasefire or a peace agreement. We also talk about peace enforcement, and that is a different type of operation, like, for instance, the Cedric mission in Mozambique or the multinational joint task force in the Lake Chad Basin. Those would be enforcement operations in the sense that they are acting against an aggressor, against an armed group, to try and bring stability in that way. And then peace building is, in the classical sense, something that comes after you've achieved some form of an end to the conflict. Then you build the peace. But today's understanding of peace building is much more cross-cutting than that. So peace building today, in a sense, is used much more as an overarching concept, which can include elements of prevention, and elements of recovery and reconstruction, mediation, dialogue, transitional justice, security sector reform. So maybe it's the most overarching concept that refers to very many different actions we can take to try and sustain peace. In other words, to prevent, to whatever level of peace that we have, to build it, to make it stronger, to prevent that from relapsing into violent conflict through a variety of actions. So that would be maybe a way of describing some of how these terminologies are used.
Yes, interesting. So if I come to the last question, you've also written about that transition to sustainable peace, moving away from that to sustainable. So how would you see overall, looking at Africa, how do we move from this peace building to obtaining sustainable peace in Africa?
Sustainable means that we sustain it ourselves, right? And we see that those societies that are peaceful, and peace is not something you achieve and then you can pack up and go home, right? It's not like a soccer game that you, at the end of this, a whistle that blows and then you've won the match and you can go home and celebrate. Peace never ends. The work for peace never ends. And we can see that even in very well-developed societies that have been peaceful for decades or centuries that are now backsliding. We know historically all empires, come to an end at some point. So, but if we look at those societies that are able to sustain their own peace, an example in South Africa in Africa would be, for instance, Mauritius or Botswana would be exemplary examples of countries that are able to sustain the peace. Tanzania is doing very well. And what you see in these societies is that there are institutions that are proactively working towards tolerance, that resolve conflicts before they become violent. There are institutions that are engaged in ensuring that different identity groups, whether they are religious groups or language groups or so on, cooperate together, create social cohesion, create social resilience. So you need to have an active engagement in sustaining your society by investing in social cohesion, by investing in resilience, and have your own institutions that are actively doing that, both governmental institutions, but also just in our ordinary society, whether it's the local church or mosque or sports club or whatever it may be, must all contribute to that overarching societal value of promoting tolerance, promoting collaboration, resolving conflicts peacefully. Of course, part of that then is also your larger society, which implies some form of economic sustainability. We know that societies that are highly unequal, where there's a huge division between rich and poor, are typically societies that experience conflict. So these are all the kind of things that we need to work against and work towards in order to find sustainable, self-sustained societies in which peace is self-sustained.
Oh, amazing. Cedric, it's listen, this is very rich and very deep insight into peace operation. Like Riley mentioned, peacekeeping or peace operations, or whatever terminology we choose to, it forms a part of a framework that has to not be the first response. It has to be one that comes after a political project has been identified and after we've had like a diplomatic response, and then that creates the opportunity for peace operation. And then we have to then start thinking in the longer term how to sustain that peace by addressing, like Ryan mentioned, the structural approach, structural conditions, and also using institutions, using some of the maybe communities, sport communities, or diff churches, all this whatever instruments we have to be able to and then also I'm happy you mentioned the economic approach that has to go hand in hand, also addressing that, creating, removing inequalities and all that. I really appreciate your time, and I appreciate you sharing your deep insight on this subject. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. Nice talking to you, and thank you very much, and good luck with your success of your podcast as well.
You're welcome. Thank you, Cedric. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Oh, thank you viewers very much for tuning in to this interesting episode. We're grateful to have Professor Cedric De Koning to share his insightful thoughts and views on peacekeeping in Africa. Stay tuned for the next episode. Thanks and goodbye.